Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ozark Mountains. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the winter of 1871, a wagon made its way through the wet clay roads between Douglas and Taney County. Inside sat a young woman named Martha Young, a newly married schoolteacher whose husband, Elias Young, had acquired a modest homestead near the ridge locals called Pine Hollow. The hills were heavy with mist that year, and the hollows smelled of cedar and damp stone. Few people traveled that way unless they had something to hide, or something they wished forgotten. Martha was 23. Records from the old courthouse in Forsyth describe her handwriting as refined and deliberate. She was said to have come from Lawrence, Kansas, following years of turmoil from the war's aftermath. The Ozarks, then, were in the long shadow of disorder, a land still trembling from what men had done to one another. Across the ridge, the stories of vigilantes and masked men still circulated, what later historians would connect to the early stirrings of the Bald Knobbers, a brotherhood of justice seekers who blurred the line between righteousness and terror. When the Youngs arrived, neighbors described them as polite but unusually reserved. Elias worked as a carpenter, while Martha offered reading lessons to local children from the front porch when weather allowed. But by midsummer, letters sent from Martha to her sister in Kansas stopped abruptly. The mail route through Ava confirmed that her last correspondence was dated June 8, 1871, a note that ended simply, "He has begun to speak in his sleep again." By late July, Elias appeared alone at the local general store in Thorne, Field, purchasing lime, canvas, and a new shovel. He explained that Martha had fallen ill and was visiting her kin across the state line. The clerk, a man named Lemuel Price, recalled that Elias seemed calm, too calm, and his clothes bore stains that were not easily accounted for. What happened next became a matter of whispers, affidavits, and burnt pages. There was talk of screams at night, of a light moving along the ridge, of dogs refusing to pass the Young homestead after dusk. Some said Martha had been seen again, though not as she was, a pale figure near the spring house, hair loose, feet bare, eyes vacant as river glass. When Reverend Silas Merton attempted to visit the property that autumn, he found the door unlatched and a sour smell rising from beneath the floorboards. His report to the county constable survives only in fragments, but one phrase has been carefully preserved in later transcriptions. "The house stands, but something beneath it does not rest." By November of that same year, snow had already touched the upper ridges, and the Young property lay silent. The neighbors, most of them subsistence farmers, kept their distance. Only Caleb Rowan, a trapper who traded pelts in Thornfield, dared to pass by. He later told the constable that he had seen a single lamp burning steady for 3 nights, then nothing at all. The following week, Elias was gone. His wagon, his horse, his tools, vanished. The hearth still smoldered when the sheriff arrived. The sheriff's report, preserved in the Taney County Ledger of January 1872, is brief but chilling. Found the residence vacant. No sign of forced entry, odor consistent with decay from under the floor. When the deputies pried up the boards, they found not one body, but 2. The first, believed to be a young woman, had been placed in rough burlap. The second, a smaller frame, clothed in a man's undershirt, was not immediately identified. The coroner's notes, written in pencil on paper that had since yellowed, mention odd preservation of the eyes, and no visible signs of struggle. Yet the most confounding detail came from a scrap of linen found clenched in the woman's hand. On it, stitched in red thread, were the initials M.Y. When word reached the nearest settlement, the reaction was uneasy rather than shocked. People had been expecting something of the sort. Some recalled Elias's strange comments about his wife's sleeplessness, that she often walked without waking, that she spoke as though reading names of the dead. Others whispered that Martha had come from a family touched by illness of the mind, that her mother had drowned herself in the Kansas River years earlier. The investigation would have ended there. Another domestic tragedy lost in the wilderness. Had it not been for the discovery of a small chest buried behind the smokehouse, unearthed accidentally by children, and chasing a stray goat. Inside were fragments of letters, a lock of dark hair tied with ribbon, and what appeared to be a wedding veil, scorched at the edges. On a scrap of paper, barely legible, someone had written, "Do not dig where the water stands still." This cryptic line reignited the rumors. A second search of the property led to the discovery of a shallow well near the edge of the woods. Its water, thick with algae, had not been drawn for months. When drained, deputies found a third body, partially decomposed, identified through boot remnants as Elias Young himself. The coroner's record stated that the man's skull had been fractured, as though by a tool of blunt iron, used with certainty. Beneath his remains was a canvas sack containing jewelry, none of which belonged to Martha. These items were traced to 3 missing travelers whose names appeared in local registries between 1869 and 1870. The Ozark community was shaken. The talk turned quickly from sorrow to fear. The house was sealed, then burned by order of the sheriff to prevent further desecration. But before the flames consumed it, Reverend Merton retrieved a single surviving object, Martha's teaching ledger, water-damaged yet still legible in parts. Among her lesson notes were careful lists of names, none of them her students, and several matching those of the missing travelers. The Springfield Republican published a small column about the case, connecting the discovery to recent accounts of rural vengeance reminiscent of those secret societies rising across the mountains. The writer drew parallels to the early vigilante movements later associated with the Bald Knobbers, suggesting the killings might have been part of an informal retribution circle. But locals refused that explanation, insisting that whatever had happened at Pine Hollow was not justice. It was something older, colder, and more deliberate. By the turn of 1872, Pine Hollow had become a name spoken low and fast, as if saying it too clearly might draw something near. The county officials debated what to do with the case. Without living witnesses, without confessions, the law had little ground to stand on. The coroner's ledger closed the investigation under the vague phrase, "domestic calamity, multiple deceased." But those who had been to the site, sheriff, reverend, and doctor alike, knew better. Dr. Harlan C. Redden, who performed the autopsy on Elias Young, wrote in his field notes that certain muscular rigidity and placement of the bones suggested the body had been positioned deliberately, perhaps even ceremonially. He later compared the arrangement to accounts he'd read from Ozark burial customs preceding the war, where the dead were interred facing east to await forgiveness. The implication was unsettling. Someone had buried Elias with care, not in panic. In the months that followed, stray reports trickled in from nearby townships. A woman fitting Martha's description, pale, slight, with her hair unbound, was seen near Rockbridge, walking along the old Mills stream at dusk. A farmer claimed she asked him if the water still whispered beneath the boards. Another report from Douglas County told of a female figure appearing at a schoolhouse door just before a storm, then vanishing when lightning struck the bell tower. None of these accounts could be verified, yet the repetition of her name grew persistent enough to warrant a brief notice in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat under the title, "The Wandering Widow of the Ozarks." The article dismissed the tale as local superstition, but made one curious reference, again linking it to the Bald Knobbers. It suggested that the same climate of fear and vengeance that had given rise to those vigilante bands might have influenced the young tragedy. Isolated justice, his. Hidden crimes, no law but one's own. Whether Martha had been their victim, participant, or something in between was left unspoken. When Reverend Merton revisited the area that spring, he found only blackened ground and charred beams. From the ashes, he recovered a single iron nail, unusually long, which he kept wrapped in linen. In his later sermons, he alluded to the Youngs without naming them directly. There are sins that do not die with the sinner. They bury themselves and wait for feet to cross above. Years later, in 1878, the property was quietly sold to a cattleman named Jonas Creel. He rebuilt a cabin on the same foundation, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to know, what had been there before. Within months, his livestock began disappearing. He blamed wolves, until one night he found the hoof prints circling the barn abruptly ending at the cellar door. His hired man quit the next morning, claiming he had seen a woman standing by the well, humming something like a hymn with no words. No one investigated these reports formally. The county's attention had shifted to more public violence, the raids and retributions spreading through Taney and Christian counties, as the vigilante presence of the bald knobbers became undeniable. In that turmoil, Pine Hollow's story slipped into rumor, half-remembered and poorly told, except among the few who still lived close enough to smell the wet cedar when the rain came. They said the sound of water running under the soil there was different, that if you stood quietly, you could hear voices counting, as though someone were taking attendance in an invisible classroom. By the winter of 1882, the first organized militia patrols began crossing southern Missouri, chasing reports of horse thieves, bootleggers, and bandits claiming allegiance to no side. Among their records is a curious entry, dated December 14th, mentioning an unnamed woman guiding us through the ridge paths east of Pine Hollow, who vanished before daylight. The officer who wrote that note, Lieutenant James Merton, was the nephew of Reverend Silas Merton, who had investigated the Young property years earlier. In a letter to his superior, he added, "She looked as though she had stepped out of another season." That same month, the militia stumbled upon remnants of a camp deep within the forest. The ash was still warm. Among the charred remains, they found a woman's shoe, small and handmade, stitched with initials that had nearly worn away, M.Y. The camp also contained fragments of a journal, its entries soaked and unreadable, save for one sentence: "I teach them to listen." No one ever claimed the objects, and the site was left unmarked. In the nearby township of Gainesville, a local physician named Dr. Albert Squires began documenting cases of shared night terrors among families living near the ridge. His report, never formally published, described how several unrelated individuals reported identical dreams of a woman with a candle tracing letters on the ground. He considered it a mass delusion triggered by isolation and fear, though privately he told his wife that he'd heard the same humming outside their cabin one night. Meanwhile, the legend of Martha Young transformed. Among travelers, she became the bride who waited at the well. Among children, a cautionary figure, Miss Martha of the Hollow, who took the names of those who lied. When someone went missing, the locals said, "The teacher's keeping roll again." In 1884, a traveling journalist from St. Louis, Hiram C. Baines, ventured into the Ozarks seeking to document these tales. His article, Echoes Beneath the Cedar, recounted testimonies from a dozen locals, all circling back to the same hollow. He wrote, "The air itself feels archival, like one walks not through land, but through memory, still breathing." Among his notes was a sketch of a narrow well surrounded by saplings and marked by a crude cross made of fence wire. He noted that birds never perched there. When Baines attempted to retrieve water from that well, he reported seeing something rise beneath the surface, Not a reflection, but a figure bending forward as though to meet him halfway. The next morning, his camp was found abandoned, his horse tethered, his journal soaked through. The last entry simply read, "She knew the names I hadn't spoken." That account was printed in a few newspapers, then quietly withdrawn after Baines was declared missing. Officially, the disappearance was blamed on bandits or misadventure. Unofficially, the locals said it was Pine Hollow claiming back what had been disturbed. By the late 1880s, only the most desperate or curious dared go near the place. Even the bald knobbers, for all their boldness, kept clear of that valley. One writer, questioned years later, said, "We rode through every corner of those hills, but not there. Some places don't forgive patrols." By 1890, the Ozark frontier was thinning. The timber industry moved in, carving away forests that had hidden secrets for generations. With the arrival of sawmills came surveyors, and with them, records. One such surveyor, Edward Hall, kept meticulous notes in his field ledger. Among his measurements of ridges and creek lines appears a strange annotation. Old foundation, stonework intact, ground sunken as though hollow beneath, avoided by mules. Hall later described finding fragments of charred glass and a rusted hinge, the remnants of the young homestead long thought lost. Intrigued, he camped nearby for 2 nights, despite warnings from local guides. In his second entry, he wrote of hearing the steady tapping of chalk, like someone teaching in the dark. When his team returned from mapping the northern ridge, Hall was gone. Only his ledger remained, found open beside the cold ashes of his campfire. His final line read, "There is more beneath than earth." Word of Hall's disappearance reached the county seat, and a small search party formed. Among them was an aging Reverend Merton, now frail but determined to see the place one last time. He led the men to the site using memory alone. They found nothing of Hall, but under the collapsed chimney stones they uncovered a tin locket, its clasp fused shut by heat. When pried open, it revealed a miniature daguerreotype of a woman resembling Martha, eyes slightly turned, expression unreadable. Inside the frame, on the reverse, was a single word etched by hand, "Forgive." The locket was placed in the county archive, where it remained for decades. But according to later correspondence from the archivist's assistant, Miss Clara Dow, the locket was never cold. She wrote in 1902, "Even through the glass case, it seems to hum faintly, like something unfinished." As the century closed, Pine Hollow's story faded from newsprint. Into local folklore, preachers still spoke of the moral lessons buried in its soil, while the few remaining elders told children not to linger near running water after sunset. Yet one curious pattern endured. Every 7 or 8 years, someone, usually a traveler or prospector, vanished along the ridge trail. Their belongings turned up neatly folded near the same creek, as though placed with intention. A regional historian named Thomas E. Caro, researching the social decay that had followed the rise and fall of the bald knobbers, revisited the Young case in 1904. His manuscript, Vigilance and Silence in the Ozarks, argued that Martha Young's story reflected the hidden rot of a society at war with its conscience. He suggested that Elias had likely been part of an early vigilante faction, that Martha's discovery of their deeds had driven her to retribution, or madness. Yet even Caro, a skeptic by profession, ended his notes with unease. Whether ghost, guilt, or ground remembering, the result is the same. The hollow teaches. By 1907, Pine Hollow was erased from most official maps, replaced by a simple contour line. But those who knew the old trails said they could still find it by following the echo of dripping water, even when there was no rain. In the early spring of 1908, a small team of students from the newly founded State Normal School at Springfield undertook a geological survey of the southern Ozarks. Among them was Miss Lydia Crane, a researcher with a fascination for local folklore. She had come across references to the Bride's Hollow in regional archives and insisted the group detour through the area for academic completeness. Her notes from that expedition, preserved in the university's collection, offer the most detailed modern glimpse into what remained of Pine Hollow. She describes a depression in the land, so still it seemed airless, surrounded by cedar trunks, twisted as if by unseen pressure. In her journal, Lydia wrote, "The soil bears the scent of burnt lime and something sweet, like lilac, though there are no flowers." The students camped by the creek for 3 nights, collecting soil samples and cataloging insect species. On the second night, one of them, Paul Redden, a distant relative of the same Dr. Redden who had examined Elias Young's body decades earlier, claimed to hear a woman's voice reciting names near the stream. He described it as calm, rhythmic, as though reading attendance. Lydia dismissed it as a dream. But by morning, Paul was gone. His boots and rucksack remained by the fire. The others, terrified, left immediately, abandoning their instruments. When questioned later, Lydia said she remembered a faint sound that morning, the scrape of chalk on wood. The following week, she submitted a report to the university, carefully omitting any mention of the disappearance. But a private letter to her mentor, discovered years later, contained a chilling confession. "I found the old ledger. The ink has run, but her hand is unmistakable. New names have been added, mine among them." The site was quietly cordoned off afterward, noted in state records as an unstable sinkhole area, though no geological reason was ever documented. Still, hikers occasionally returned with strange tales. Unexplained whispers, echoes of recitation, and lights moving below the soil as if reflected through unseen water. Around that same time, old Reverend Merton, now near death, dictated a final letter to his nephew. In it, he wrote of the day he had seen the well for the last time. "It is not water that glimmers there," he said. "It is the residue of knowing. The teacher waits for pupils still." When he died, his Bible was found open on the verse, "The earth shall disclose her blood." Some took that as symbolic, others a warning. By 1910, a few journalists revisited the legend, linking it once more to the shadow of the bald knobbers and the brutal ethics that had once governed the Ozarks. They argued that Martha Young was no ghost, but a woman twisted by violence and isolation, an emblem of the frontier's moral collapse. Yet their conclusions felt hollow, unable to explain why so many who went to Pine Hollow were never seen again. Even in official circles, the story persisted. A state inspector visiting the region in 1912 reported that during a heavy rain, he heard something like recitation carried by the wind. He could make out one phrase clearly before it faded: present. The year 1913 brought the flood, one that tore through the valleys of southern Missouri and washed away what little remained of Pine Hollow's traces. Farms were uprooted, bridges vanished, and the old logging road to the hollow collapsed entirely. When the waters receded weeks later, the land seemed rearranged, as though the earth itself had shifted to cover what it no longer wished to show. But nature, in its silence, leaves records of its own. A post-flood report by the U.S. Geological Survey mentioned an anomaly in the area: a deep fissure exposing timbers of artificial origin, and, more unsettlingly, remnants of lime-coated masonry inconsistent with frontier architecture. The inspector, a man named Frank Porter, included a short addendum in his field notebook that was later censored from the official archive. It read, "Under the first layer, an outline of steps descending into water. Beneath that, faces, or what the mind takes for faces." Around that same time, letters surfaced in nearby West Plains, written by an elderly woman identifying herself as M.Y. The handwriting matched, at least roughly, that found in the teaching ledger decades before. In them, she spoke of unfinished lessons and asked that certain names be remembered properly this time. She signed one of her final letters with the line, "I am where the well once was, but the water runs elsewhere now." No one could trace where those letters had come from. Local folklore began to mutate once again. In the retellings, Martha Young was no longer a mere ghost, but a record keeper, a spirit bound to correct the names of the forgotten. Children dared each other to whisper their full names into old wells after dark, believing that if she heard, she would write them safely. Others swore that those who did never spoke their names again. In 1915, the county tried to build a road across the hollow to see, annexed 2 new lumber routes. The foreman, Henry Stiles, reported strange problems with his workers: tools breaking without cause, oxen refusing to pull near the southern ridge, and men waking at night muttering lines from old school lessons. After 3 weeks of setbacks, the company abandoned the project entirely, citing unsuitable ground conditions. One of the engineers, in his report, added quietly in the margin, "There's nothing wrong with the ground. It just remembers too much." The few remaining elders of Taney County regarded that as the final warning. For decades afterward, maps deliberately left that area blank. People spoke of it indirectly as the place east of the Cedar Run, or simply where she taught. And yet, the occasional traveler still passed through, photographers, poets, soldiers on leave, drawn by curiosity or something harder to name. A 1917 diary from one such traveler, Captain Howard Bell, survives in fragments. He wrote, "I thought I heard someone teaching. I could almost see the classroom, the smell of lime, chalk dust in the sun, but there was only the sound of dripping." After that entry, the diary ends abruptly. His body was never recovered. By 1918, the world beyond the Ozarks was collapsing into the Great War. Young men left their farms and hills behind, and Pine Hollow became little more than a whisper of an older, forgotten unease. Yet war has a strange way of stirring what lies dormant. Letters from soldiers stationed in France began to surface in local papers. Letters mentioning dreams of home and of a woman by the well who called their names in order. One of them, a private named Caleb Phelps, the grandson of the old county clerk, wrote to his mother, "She was there, Ma, in the field of tents. She said the roll is longer now." The family never received another letter from him. His unit perished at Bellow Wood that summer. When the war ended, Missouri turned to rebuilding. In 1919, a group of land investors from St. Louis proposed reopening the area around Pine Hollow for a resort project, believing the cedar-lined ridges could attract travelers seeking peace. A surveyor named Martin Croft was hired to assess the land. His surviving field sketch, now stored at the Historical Society, shows neat elevation lines and measurements, except for a single shaded circle marked "Do Not Enter." In his accompanying notes, Croft wrote, "Ground unstable, faint sound beneath surface, rhythmic, possibly water, possibly something else." 2 weeks later, Croft vanished. His partner, who had remained at the logging camp, swore he heard the faint sound of tapping on the wood of the bunkhouse wall that same night, measured, deliberate, like chalk against slate. After that, interest in the land evaporated. Locals said the hills took back what was theirs. The cedars grew thick again, and the hollow disappeared beneath vines and moss. Yet every few years, hikers or prospectors still returned with stories too similar to ignore. The scent of lilac where none bloomed, the echo of recited lessons in the air, the feeling of being quietly observed. In 1920, the Springfield Gazette published an anniversary piece titled "The Bride Who Taught the Dead." It summarized 50 years of rumor, from the first tragedy in 1871 to the most recent disappearances, and proposed a rational conclusion that the legend of Martha Young had grown out of overlapping traumas: isolation, war, and memory. But near the end of the article, the writer noted a curious correspondence. Across every account, whether from settlers, soldiers, or scholars, one constant remained: the act of teaching, not haunting, not vengeance, teaching. As the piece concluded, if she ever lived, Martha Young was not merely a victim of the Ozarks' darkness. She became its archivist, preserving what others wished forgotten. The article drew brief attention, then faded like all the rest. But that spring, hikers following the creek after a heavy thaw discovered something newly exposed by erosion: a fragment of slate, flat and rectangular, its surface etched by hand. The words, though faint, could still be read: "Class dismissed. Until the rain returns." The slate tablet was sent to the county office in Forsyth for examination, though no one claimed ownership. It was filed under unidentified artifact, then quietly misplaced. Yet within months, similar reports emerged from across the region: stones carved with fragments of script found in creek beds or near collapsed wells. Some bore letters arranged like attendance lists, while others carried faint markings resembling tally lines. Scholars who examined them noted the handwriting was consistent, fine, and deliberate, with a curvature uncommon to men of that era. By late 1921, the Ozark folklore societies began to take interest. Professor Elias Harmon of the University of Missouri compiled an informal report on persistent educational motifs in rural haunt traditions. In it, he referenced Pine Hollow as the epicenter of a pedagogical haunting, noting that every retelling retained the elements of a teacher, a lesson, and unfinished instruction. He compared it to ancient customs in which the dead were thought to linger until their duties were properly fulfilled. Yet even Harmon, in his closing remarks, wrote, "I suspect that what remains at the hollow is not spirit, but structure, the repetition of grief seeking pattern." That same winter, a storm tore through Taney County, uprooting trees and exposing a deep gully where the hollow had once been. A traveling photographer, Miss Edna Lowell, visited days later to capture the devastation. Her glass plates, now clouded and cracked with age, still reveal what appears to be a schoolroom desk half buried in mud, its legs snapped, its surface marked with faint initials, MY etched deep into the wood grain. When Edna developed the negatives, she wrote in her notes, "There is a shape standing just beyond the cedar line, blurred but upright." Skeptics later called it a trick of exposure, a double image caused by the long shut, a time common in wet plate photography. Others weren't so sure. The outline was faint, yes, but it had shoulders and a face angled downward as if reading. Following that, a local boy named Samuel Creel, descendant of the cattleman who once owned the land, claimed he'd found a locket near the creek. When he opened it, he said he heard a faint melody, like a hymn sung through stone. The locket was described as identical to the one found decades earlier. Same engraving, same word inside, forgive. But when county officials went to retrieve it, the boy refused to hand it over, saying it wasn't his to give. He disappeared 2 days later while walking to school. His mother later found his notebook under his bed, filled with names written over and over again in a precise, adult hand. By the early 1920s, Pine Hollow had become a place of study for those drawn to the intersection of folklore and psychology. Yet no one stayed long. The few who did returned with headaches, insomnia, or an uneasy fixation with order and attendance. Some said the sound of dripping water in the hollow wasn't water at all, it was counting. Still, the records persisted, filed, misplaced, rediscovered, and lost again. And though the hills had grown quiet, travelers claimed that on certain nights, when the mist clung low, you could hear the scratch of chalk and a woman's voice softly saying, "Begin." In the summer of 1922, the Missouri State Historical Society sponsored an expedition to verify the claims surrounding Pine Hollow. 3 men and 1 woman, a linguist, a geologist, a photographer, and a local guide, were tasked with documenting what remained. Their findings, never formally published, survive in a single carbon copy marked Field Notes Restricted. They arrived in June and set up camp along the upper creek. The guide, Nathaniel Hodge, warned them to avoid the old well site, which by then was little more than a depression surrounded by moss and thin birch saplings. He claimed the ground there never took the sun right. But on the second night, the linguist, Professor Alan Kerr, wandered off to collect samples. When he returned near dawn, he appeared shaken. His notebook contained neat transcriptions of a language he claimed he did not know he had written, rows of names, each followed by the same phrase repeated, "accounted for." Kerr left the following morning, saying he had fallen ill. He made it to Springfield, where he checked into a small boarding house and within a week died of what the coroner described as exhaustive delirium. Among his belongings was a letter to a colleague, unsent, reading, "She corrects the roll. That is all she ever does." The remaining team members continued their study. The photographer, Clara Marin, took several glass exposures of the hollow at twilight. The plates, later examined by the society, revealed streaks of faint white lines intersecting across the frame. Initially dismissed as light leaks, the lines were later observed to form angular patterns, almost like handwriting viewed from above. On the last night of the expedition, a thunderstorm swept through the ridge. Hodge, the guide, awoke to the sound of what he thought was rain tapping on tin, but realized as it grew rhythmic that it was coming from undergrow, und. He described it as like someone knocking, polite and patient. When morning came, the geologist was missing. His instruments were left arranged in a perfect circle, each pointing toward the well. The expedition disbanded after that. Marin returned to St. Louis and burned her negatives. In her later years, she was known to tell children a strange story, that some lessons were never meant to end, only to echo. Her last recorded words, written shakily before her death in 1937, were, "She's still teaching, but there's no one left to learn." The hollow was officially closed to visitors that same year. County officials cited erosion hazards, though locals knew better. They said the rains had begun to rise there again, flooding from within, as if the ground itself were exhaling. And still, there were those who went anyway, poachers, wanderers, and seekers of truth. One such traveler in 1925 wrote in his journal, "I stood by the hollow's edge and heard the wind moving through the birches. Each branch struck another like knuckles on a desk." He ended that entry with a single sentence, eerily familiar after all those years. He has begun to speak in his sleep again. By 1926, the legend of Pine Hollow had begun to fade from most townsfolk memory, surviving only as campfire talk among the younger generations who no longer feared it but recited it for thrills. The elders shook their heads at that. They said the hollow didn't need believers to stay alive. It only needed silence. That same year, a traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Wilder stopped in Thornfield during a revival tour. He was known for collecting accounts of the uncanny to use as sermons on temptation and divine warning. Hearing of the Bride's Hollow, he rode out one morning alone, claiming he would lay the story to rest with prayer. He did not return by nightfall. A search party found his horse tied to a cedar the saddle wet, though no rain had fallen. His Bible was open beside the well depression, the pages marked not by wind, but by what looked like chalk dust. The open page bore underlined words from the Gospel of Luke, "What is done in secret shall be shouted from the housetops." Beneath, faint handwriting, definitely not printed, added, "But some lessons are never to be shouted." The discovery unsettled even the skeptical sheriff, Henry Fordham, who ordered the area sealed once more. But by then, it seemed the hollow had already moved beyond law or superstition. Reports came in from miles away, small schoolhouses, farmyards, even church basements, where chalkboards were found, covered in names none of the teachers had written. The handwriting was the same looping script that clerks and archivists had come to recognize from the old ledger. Deliberate, elegant, unmistakably feminine. In one such incident near Ava, the teacher, Miss Ruth Elkins, returned to her classroom after dusk to retrieve forgotten papers. She found all the lamps lit and the alphabet written backwards across the wall, perfectly straight, ending in her own name. She fainted on the spot. And she awoke. The words were gone, and the air smelled faintly of lilac. She left the county within a week, abandoning her post. The pattern repeated across the region over the next 2 years. Unexplained chalk markings, recitations heard by children, dreams shared between strangers. The phenomenon grew quiet after 1928, as if an unseen cycle had completed. That same year, the last living witness to the original tragedy, Clara Dow, the former archivist's assistant who once described the humming locket, passed away. Among her effects was a letter she had written but never mailed. It read simply, "I hear her counting. It is slower now, but still she counts." For decades after, the hollow remained untouched. New maps placed it beneath a forest preserve, its name forgotten, its coordinates absorbed into the folds of land that hid it. But even silence has weight. The locals claimed that on windless nights, if you pressed your ear to the ground, you could hear a soft rhythm, not the sound of water or root, but of writing. By 1930, the old Ozark ways were giving way to the hum of radios and paved roads, yet the past clung stubbornly to its corners, and Pine Hollow was one of them. The Depression had driven many to scavenge forgotten lands for lumber or relics to sell, and so it was that Earl Matthews, a drifter from Arkansas, wandered into the area looking for salvageable timber. Matthews's journal, later found in a Springfield pawnshop, recounts his journey with unusual precision. He described stumbling upon a clearing of strange symmetry, the trees growing in 2 even lines, like rows of desks. He wrote of finding fragments of slate tablets and small iron hooks that looked like they once held lessons, not clothes. He camped there for one night. His final entry reads, "The ground hums, like a tune I nearly remember." When the sheriff's men found his camp weeks later, they discovered his fire still cold, his belongings undisturbed, and a piece of slate propped beside a log. It bore a single word, carved shallowly, "Stay." The report made its way to the county courthouse, where it joined a growing pile of unsubstantiated incidents. Yet one clerk, Walter Baines, a distant relative of the journalist who vanished in the 1880s, became obsessed with the recurring handwriting. He compared the slate markings to preserved copies of Martha Young's teaching notes. The loops, spacing, and curvature matched exactly. 59 years apart, the same hand. Walter's notes grow erratic after that point. His final memo to the county archivist ends mid-sentence. If she is writing still, then someone must be reading. In 1933, a drought struck the region again. The creeks thinned to trickles, and one evening a small sinkhole opened where the well once lay, revealing a half-flooded chamber beneath. Two farmhands lowering a rope reported seeing rows of shapes, all seated. But when a lantern was dropped, the reflections seemed to multiply. Faces staring up from the black water, eyes open but unmoving. The men fled, and the hollow collapsed overnight, swallowing the pit. When word spread, the county sealed the area permanently, planting new cedars over the site. For a time, it seemed the hollow was finally done with its visitors. Yet even in town, the echoes persisted. A teacher at the local grammar school complained that her students began addressing her as Miss Young, without knowing why. Another reported the smell of wet chalk whenever she erased the blackboard. By then, most dismissed it as hysteria or coincidence, until one night in 1935, when the church bells in Thornfield rang on their own at midnight. The caretaker found the pull rope swinging wildly, though no one was inside. Beneath the bell, on the wooden floorboards, someone had written in chalk, "Lesson resumed." The handwriting, once again, was hers. The incident at the church marked the quiet return of a pattern that many had tried to forget. Between 1936 and 1938, reports came from 3 counties, each describing what residents called the whispering teacher. In farmhouses, barns, and empty schoolrooms, people heard the soft repetition of names, counted slowly, always ending with a pause before the word present. Newspapers rarely printed these stories, but letters to editors reveal an undercurrent of unease. One correspondent wrote, "If we have inherited our land, perhaps we have inherited her lessons too." Another claimed his young daughter awoke nightly to the sound of a woman humming, her pillow damp, as though from the rain underground. In 1937, construction began on a new dam project in the southern Ozarks, intended to flood a portion of the valley, including, unintentionally, the remnants of Pine Hollow. Workers reported finding stone fragments and timbers deep in the basin, preserved beneath layers of silt. One diver recovered an iron nail of unusual length, identical to the one Reverend Merton had once kept. He described it as warm to the touch, even underwater. Supervisors ordered the site cleared quickly. They wanted no delays. When the dam filled the following spring, the hollow vanished under the rising waters of the new reservoir. Locals believed that, at last, the past had been buried for good. The valley became a lake, blue and still, drawing fishermen and tourists who had never heard the name Martha Young. But old currents do not always die. They adapt. That first summer, campers on the lake began reporting an odd echo. When they called out, their voices would return, not as an echo, but as repetition, their own words rearranged, sometimes corrected. One boy shouted, "Who's there?" And the response, faint but precise, came back, "Present." Divers who maintained the dam spoke of a strange assure when descending near the center. One reported hearing what sounded like a pencil scraping, though no movement was visible. Another refused to return underwater, claiming he had seen rows of seats, pale beneath the silt, like waiting pupils. By 1939, a few towns along the shore began to avoid talking about the new lake altogether. Fishing guides stopped taking clients near the central basin, calling it the deep classroom. And yet, the legend persisted quietly, reshaped for a new generation, children whispering that the woman who once taught in the hills now kept her school beneath the water, her lessons carried by the current. An elderly farmer, interviewed that same year, summed up the feeling best. You can drown a house, but you can't drown what it remembers. And when storms rolled through the Ozarks and thunder echoed across the lake, some swore they heard, faint through the rain, the sound of chalk striking slate, counting, always counting, as though the lesson had simply moved below. When the 1940s arrived, the new lake became a postcard image, calm, mirror-like, and deceptively ordinary. Vacationers built cabins along its edge, and fishermen launched boats from its shallow banks, unaware that their oars disturbed the buried timbers of Pine Hollow beneath. Yet, as the decade unfolded, the locals began to notice peculiar things. Ripples forming on windless mornings, soft knocks against the hulls of empty boats, and on clear days, the faint outline of a roof just visible beneath the surface, appearing, then vanishing with the sun. In 1943, a hydroelectric engineer named Dr. Stephen Caro, grandson of historian Thomas Caro, was assigned to inspect the dam's lower turbines. His personal log describes a pattern of malfunctions that occurred only on overcast days. "The machinery slows," he wrote, "as though listening." He dismissed it as coincidence, until one inspection required a deep-water dive. His written account of that dive, later retrieved from his desk after his death, is meticulous up to a point. He noted the usual descent measurements and visibility readings. Then, the entries change. "Turbine housing intact. Silt displacement minimal," he wrote. However, discernible murmuring near intake. Indistinct female voice repeating syllables. Sounds like recitation. At a depth of 50 feet, his log ends with one unfinished line. "She knows the order better than I do." Dr. Caro never resurfaced. His tether line was found intact, the reel unbroken. Divers sent after him refused to go deeper, reporting movement of unnatural rhythm in the current. The lake was closed for maintenance that year, though the official explanations cited only hydraulic irregularities. In the years that followed, the shoreline shifted, swallowing what remained of the old trail. Locals stopped visiting after dark. Some nights, a mist would rise from the center of the lake, carrying a smell like chalk dust and lilac. One fisherman claimed to have seen writing form briefly on the water's surface, rows of words, neat as a ledger, before dispersing into ripples. The stories might have remained mere folklore if not for an incident in 1946. A group of schoolchildren from Ava visited the lake for a picnic. While their teacher counted attendance, one girl, Marjorie Leland, age 9, interrupted, saying, "You forgot Miss Young." When corrected, she insisted, "She's here. She's the one taking the names." The teacher laughed it off, but later that afternoon, Marjorie was found standing knee-deep at the water's edge, staring downward. When pulled away, she whispered, "She's under the desks." The girl spoke little after that day, though in her drawings years later, she filled pages with figures seated in rows beneath waves, each marked with faint halos of light. The lake remained serene to outsiders, shimmering and harmless, but those who lived nearest it began to move away, leaving houses empty, porches sagging, windows blank. They said it wasn't haunted exactly, just restless. Something beneath it still waited for a class that would never end. By the early 1950s, the story of Pine Hollow had become a generational whisper, told only by grandmothers who spoke of it like a caution, half prayer and half memory. The younger folk dismissed it as superstition, yet strange accounts persisted. Fishermen reeled in catchless lines that came up tangled with fragments of blackened wood or small metal hooks shaped like those once used for hanging classroom slates. In 1952, the local power company lowered the lake's level for maintenance. As the waters receded, the upper foundations of the old settlement briefly emerged, a row of stones, the corner of a chimney, and, at the very center, the circular mouth of the well. The discovery drew curious onlookers. Among them was Dr. Lydia Crane, the same researcher who, decades earlier as a student, had visited the hollow and lost her colleague. Now, elderly and frail, she leaned on a cane as she stood before the newly exposed ground. Witnesses said she grew pale, whispering, "The names are still there." She asked the foreman for permission to approach the well, but he refused. The mud was unstable. That night, she returned alone. At dawn, her cane was found by the waterline, upright, as though deliberately placed. The next morning, workers noticed faint writing around the exposed rim, nearly washed away by rain. The words read, "Lesson reviewed, student returned." The well was resealed within days, the lake refilled, and the event buried beneath new currents. Dr. Crane's disappearance was recorded as accidental drowning, though her body was never recovered. Her notebooks, later found in her boarding room, contained several transcriptions of names, beginning with those from her original expedition and ending with her own, written last. Not long after, a government official overseeing the reservoir noted a strange drop in the water's temperature, localized directly above the old hall. "It feels," he wrote, "like standing above a cold breath." Divers confirmed the phenomenon, but found no mechanical explanation. One diver reported hearing a pencil dragged slowly over paper through his radio headset, even though he was alone. By 1955, the site was quietly reclassified as a restricted hydrological anomaly. Only a few civil engineers and surveyors had clearance to access it. One of them, Arthur Denton, later confessed to a reporter that he had heard what he described as the faint sound of recitation underwater. When asked if he believed it was Martha Young, he smiled thinly and said, "No, I think it's the ones she taught." Over time, even the officials stopped visiting. The lake remained calm, deceptively ordinary, until heavy storms came and the waves took on a rhythm not quite natural, like the measured cadence of someone marking time on a desk. And though the sound was easily explained away by wind and current, some claimed it wasn't echoing the storm at all. It was keeping count. When questioned, the few remaining locals only said, "She's still teaching. The lesson never ends. Only the students change." By 1957, the lake's shoreline had shifted again, and a small maintenance crew was dispatched to reinforce a section of embankment that had begun to erode. Among them was James Phelps, a descendant of the same clerk who once met the veiled woman claiming to be Martha Young back in 1879. James was a practical man, no patience for folklore, but he recorded every detail of that assignment in his logbook. The crew began work in late August, dredging silt and setting anchors. During their second night on site, a steady tapping came from the water near the dredge platform. At first they blamed it on loose chains, but when the sound continued, rhythmic, patient, and unmistakably deliberate, they realized it wasn't metal at all. It was like knuckles on a desk, James wrote. 1, 2, 1, 2, pause. He didn't mention it again in his reports, but the next morning he found faint lines in the mud beside the barge, drawn with perfect precision. Each was numbered. The men laughed it off until one of them, Eddie Talbot, failed to return from a supply run along the shore. His footprints stopped at the water's edge, where a pattern of parallel lines had been etched into the sand, as if with chalk. When James showed the discovery to his supervisor, the markings had already begun to dissolve with the tide. Within a week, 2 more workers quit, refusing to stay after sunset. One claimed he'd heard a woman's voice counting softly just before dawn. Another swore he saw someone standing knee-deep in the shallows, facing away, her skirt floating weightless around her. The foreman dismissed it all as fatigue, but by September, the project was halted without explanation. James returned home and never spoke publicly about what happened. But among his belongings, found after his death in 1962, was a single photograph, blurry, overexposed, yet unmistakable. It showed the surface of the lake under, or a gray sky, and at its center, faint lettering just visible through the reflection. Experts later argued over whether it was a trick of light or a scratch on the film, but those who saw it up close agreed on what it spelled: attendance complete. After that, no further attempts were made to interfere with the site. It was left to the water and the trees. The state declared the surrounding area a conservation zone, forbidding dredging or development. Over time, it became a quiet place again, birds nesting in reeds, the surface glassy and still. Yet on rare nights, fishermen drifting near the center spoke of the same inexplicable feeling, the sense of being observed without malice, as if someone, somewhere below, was taking note of them, patiently marking a list that would never be read aloud. Those who lingered claimed to hear a whisper rising through the mist, not quite a voice, but something between breath and memory. The bell will ring again. The 1960s brought a kind of uneasy quiet. New highways and radios filled the Ozarks with sound, drowning out the old silences where stories used to live. Yet the lake remained curiously apart, untouched by the rhythm of progress. It was as though the land itself refused to move on. In 1964, a documentary team from Kansas City visited the area to film a short piece on forgotten legends of Missouri. They interviewed aging locals about Pine Hollow, though most dismissed it as just something our grandparents whispered to keep us from wandering. Still, the team decided to film at the lake's edge, hoping for atmospheric shots. Their sound technician, Henry Lewis, later recalled that during the first take, an establishing shot of the water at dusk, the microphones began to pick up faint audio interference, the steady scratch of chalk. Assuming it was equipment noise, he checked the reels later that night. What he heard made him leave the project entirely. Between the ambient sounds of wind and water, a voice could be heard clearly, female, calm, measured, reading names. They played it back multiple times. Each repetition added new names, overlapping the last, until the tape ended with one word, whispered almost affectionately, listening. The footage was never released. The production halted within weeks. One of the researchers reportedly fell ill with fever and paranoia, repeating in his delirium that, "She's keeping track again." The raw tapes were sealed in the archive vault of the station and, according to inventory notes from 1971, later lost in a fire. But fragments survived. A single frame from the footage, rescued before the fire, shows the surface of the lake under fading light. There, just at the boundary between water and sky, appears a faint shape resembling a woman's reflection, her head inclined, as if looking down at unseen pages. By 1968, the old reside. Nates had all but vanished, replaced by newcomers unaware of the legend. Yet certain habits endured. Locals still refused to swim in the center of the lake. Teachers at the nearby elementary school avoided keeping attendance allowed. And every so often, during thunderstorms, the church bell in Thornfield, disused for decades, would ring once. Only once, never twice. Some called it coincidence. Others said it was a reminder. A historian visiting from St. Louis that same year noted in his field journal, "The Pine Hollow story has evolved into something quieter now, less warning, more observation. It's as if the land itself is writing the lesson anew, without her, yet in her hand." By then, nearly a century had passed since the young homestead burned. The hills had changed, the faces had changed, but one thing had not: the sense that something beneath the surface, whether guilt, grief, or memory, was still recording. The 1970s came, and with them the last generation who remembered the story firsthand. The world beyond the Ozarks was rushing forward, moon landings, new wars, new faith in progress. But along the lake, time still seemed reluctant to move. There were no more sightings, no new vanishings, only the occasional echo when the wind passed through the cedars. In 1973, a drought dropped the waterline lower than it had been in decades. Children from the nearby town wandered along the exposed banks, collecting bottles and driftwood. One boy, Daniel Fordham, found what he thought was a piece of slate. He brought it home to use as a writing board. The next morning, his mother found it propped against his window, words appearing faintly across it in white residue. Begin where we ended. The board was thrown into the fire that evening, but it did not burn clean. The family left the county within the month. By then, the story had faded into a private superstition, a thing people knew but did not name. On quiet evenings, fishermen still claimed the water had a pulse, rising and falling as if stirred from within. They said it wasn't frightening, just solemn, like breathing. In 1979, a university researcher studying rural legends revisited Pine Hollow's archives and wrote a final assessment. His name was Dr. Joseph Merrin, grandson of the old photographer Clara Merrin. In his report, he tried to demystify the events, reducing them to human terms: tragedy, isolation, the echoes of trauma passed through generations. Yet his closing note carried an unease beyond scholarship. There is a rhythm that cannot be measured by seconds or years. It belongs to the land itself. Some lessons continue whether we are listening or not. He mailed the report to the state archives on a Thursday. 3 days later, he was found drowned in the same lake, his car keys still in his pocket. Divers described the water as unusually clear that day, almost lit from beneath. After that, Pine Hollow's story slipped finally into silence. The state forest grew thick around the lake. Maps no longer marked where the settlement had been. The few who hiked there spoke of a hush unlike anywhere else. No birds, no insects, just the low sound of moving water, like a whisper running under the soil. And sometimes, when storms gather and thunder rolls across the ridges, locals say the echo doesn't fade as it should. Instead, it returns slowly, shaped into words that cannot quite be caught, except for one: soft, deliberate, unmistakable, present. The Ozarks sleep around it still, their cedars drinking from forgotten wells. The house is gone, the teacher gone, yet the lesson continues, quietly marked in water, in earth, in every name the wind carries across that valley. For those who listen long enough, they say, the hollow still answers, never cruel, never kind, just keeping record, one voice at a time,